What if this story of Islam's arrival in South Asia isn't about invasion, but integration? In our final episode, we explore how a book of conquest challenges deep-rooted myths and reimagines a shared pluralistic past. Welcome to this deep dive.
Great to be here.
We're taking on a big, often contested question today. How did Islam first arrive in South Asia?
It's definitely a historical question, but wow, does it resonate today?
It really does. And our guide through this is Manan Ahmed Asif's book, A Book of Conquest. He takes a really close look at a very old text, the Chachnama, and, well, finds something quite different from the usual story.
That's right. Our goal here is to explore the source material we have, specifically Asif's work, to understand how he reinterprets the Chachnama and maybe see what that new perspective means for how we think about, a really pivotal moment in South Asian history.
Okay, so before we dive into Asif's argument itself, maybe let's lay out the standard narrative first, the one his book is pushing against.
Good idea.
What does that traditional story typically sound like?
Well, according to the source material we looked at, the common count really zeroes in on the military side of things. Specifically, the Umayyad Caliphate's incursions into Sindh and the coastal areas of western India back in the 8th century CE.
Right, military campaigns. And in that telling, there's often this stark division, isn't there? Muslims presented as like a totally external foreign presence arriving among the native Hindu population.
Exactly. That foreignness is key. And significantly, this interaction is often painted as the starting point for, well, mutual animosity. Some even suggest it kind of set the stage for the subcontinent's partition centuries and centuries later.
Wow. So it's a narrative really centered on foreign imposition conflict right from the get-go.
It is a very powerful, long-lasting story about foundational difference.
But Asif, by going back to the Chachnama, offers something fundamentally different. Can you tell us a bit about the Chachnama itself? What is it, according to the source?
Sure. So the Chachnama is a text from the 13th century. It tells the story of Chachna. He was a Brahmin ruler in Sindh, and then covers the later conquest of that kingdom by the Muslim general Muhammad bin Qasim in 711 CE.
Okay.
And the source notes it's been this touchstone of Indian history for ages. But interestingly, it's seldom studied cover to cover in its entirety.
That is interesting. And Asif's challenge to how it's usually understood sounds pretty bold. What are the main things he argues the Chachnama is not?
Well, he tackles two really big assumptions based on our source material. First, this long-held idea that the Chachnama is just a straightforward translation of an earlier Arabic account. He says no.
Okay, not a translation. What's the second thing?
The second is the idea that it's basically just a history of military conquest, an imperial story. He argues against that too.
So neither a simple translation nor just a war chronicle.
Precisely. The source explains he shows it was originally written in Persian. And instead of just being about battles, Asif argues it's actually a really complex, quite subtle work of political theory.
Political theory, okay.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really fascinating. He demonstrates the text is deeply rooted in both the Indic and the Islamic ways of thinking, the ethos of both.
Can you unpack that a bit? What does the source mean by Indic and Islamic ethos here?
Right. So based on the source, Indic ethos seems to mean the political ideas, the traditions, the ways of thinking that were already there, native to the South Asian context, the local ways of ruling, society, belief.
Got it. Local context.
And Islamic ethos refers to the political and ethical frameworks coming from the Islamic tradition. Asif is saying the Chachnama isn't just one or the other, it's actively drawing on both at the same time.
So his approach, as the source describes it, he's reading it not as something imposed, but as an Indic text that happens to be written in Persian, coming from that local environment.
Exactly. He places it smack dab in the political world of 13th century Sindh. And reading it that way, he finds it actually lays out a theory for how a just ruler should govern, how to manage accommodation between different groups, how to build alliances, all within that specific complex regional setting.
And the source mentioned it focused on the relationship between the existing Brahmin Hindu elites and the new Muslim polity.
Yeah.
That sounds much more interactive than just conquest and replacement.
It really does. It suggests dialogue, not just dominance. And, the source material then explains how this more nuanced text got misunderstood later on.
Ah, yes.
It points specifically to British colonial officials who found the Chachnama, misread it perhaps willfully, perhaps not, and then used that interpretation to prop up their own theory.
Which theory was that?
The theory of inherent despotic Muslim rule in India. They basically twisted this text to fit their narrative about a fundamental, long-standing conflict between Hindus and Muslims.
And that misreading obviously has huge downstream effects. shaping how people even today view those early interactions, sometimes fueling modern political tensions.
Absolutely. The source really positions Asif's work as a vital corrective. It's presented as this important piece of social and intellectual history that pushes back against that sharp divide, the Muslim past versus Hindu past, that often defines politics in Pakistan and India today.
It suggests things were maybe more tangled, more integrated, even back then.
Yes, more complex than just us versus them.
And this project seems bigger than just one book or one text. The source says Asif's approach challenges how South Asian history is often studied in general.
It does. It's quite striking how academia itself has sometimes mirrored these divisions. The source points out this tendency for the study of Indic history and Muslim history to live in separate boxes.
Separate silos, yeah.
And you see it reflected in divisions between fields like Indologists versus historians, between periods, ancient, medieval, modern, even between archives based on language. Persian here, Sanskrit there, Arabic over here, Tamil somewhere else, and of course, separate national histories.
It's like scholars, maybe without meaning to, ended up reinforcing these categories, treating Muslim paths and Hindu paths as if they were totally sealed off from each other.
Right. And the source helps us see why that might have happened. You had colonial studies focusing intensely on 712 CE, that moment with bin Qasim, framing it as the violent origin point. Then later, conquerors coming from Central Asia just reinforced that feeling of Muslims as fundamental foreign rulers in South Asia.
And scholarship often tried to explain Muslim figures or states mainly by looking back to their supposed lands of origin, Arabia, Iran, wherever, instead of looking at how they operated within the South Asian context they actually lived in.
Exactly. People like Emperor Akbar or Darshiko, who are famous for engaging across traditions, often get treated as weird exceptions.
Not as part of a potentially longer ongoing interaction.
Right. And the source makes a really crucial point here. Scholars find it totally normal to connect, say, Persian texts across different time periods and regions ruled by Muslims, but it's been much less common to take Persian and Sanskrit texts from the exact same time and place and ask how they might be speaking to each other or dealing with similar local issues.
Even if they were produced in the same city. Read by the same people, perhaps.
Precisely. So Asif's bigger argument, it seems, is that we need to stop looking at everything purely through this lens of religious difference. We need, as the source puts it, new histories of our collective pasts, histories that recognize the shared landscapes and the intertwined nature of these traditions.
And the source adds a methodological point, too, that just focusing on abstract concepts or big political events isn't enough.
Sure.
We need to understand the life of the text itself.
Yeah, how did it actually circulate? Who read it? How did it function in its specific social and political world? Ignoring that, the source suggests, means we miss a huge part of the picture.
This really connects to that amazing anecdote in the source material. The author's encounter with a local historian in the old city of Uch.
Ah, yes. The meeting with the elderly Murak, the historian in the graveyard. That story really sticks with you.
It does, because this historian in Uch, he talked about history in two completely different ways.
I did. There was what he called outside history.
Right.
That's the big stuff. Military campaigns, emperors, empires like Alexander, the Moguls, the British, the stuff of textbooks maybe.
Amen.
And then there was internal history. This wasn't about armies and dates. It was found in Sufi saints, mystics, shrines, even old trees, objects, the walls themselves. And this internal history, the historian claimed, held a deeper inner Bettini truth.
A truth the outside history missed or even distorted.
Exactly. A truth only the true historian could access by reading the inner meaning hidden within these material things.
Which leads us to the cannonball.
The cannonball story, yes. The historian shows the author this old cannonball near a shrine, and he claims that when the British attacked Uch, their cannonballs literally bounced off the shrines because the city was spiritually protected.
And the author, being an academic historian, is thinking about the documented facts.
Right. He knows Uch was taken by the British General Napier, and pretty easily. So he says to the Uch historian, but Uch was conquered, pointing out the material fact.
How did the historian react?
He just held the author's gaze, let the comment hang there, and basically told him to put the cannonball back. At that moment, the author was stuck on the empirical evidence, the military outcome, the outside history.
But the source explains he later realized what the Uch historian was getting at.
Yes. All those conquests, the outside history of Uch being taken over again and again, didn't actually negate the spiritual and cultural resilience of the place. That was the internal history the historian valued.
So from the perspective of faraway empires, Uch was just another conquered town. But from within Uch, there was this continuity, this deep resilience.
Exactly. Found in the local networks, the shrines, the practices tied to them, the texts people read and copied, like the Chachnama, the markets, the social connections. That's what kept Uch alive, in a sense.
And this local, intertwined world is exactly the kind of environment that could produce a text like the Chachnama, deeply rooted in the Indic context, written in Persian, engaging both traditions.
That's the key insight from the anecdote, as the source presents it. A story focused only on conquest, on Uch being always conquered, simply can't explain how a text like the Chachnama came to be or why it survived.
The Uch historian's internal history offered a different kind of truth about persistence, about local vitality that endures despite the outside history of military defeat.
Yeah, a really powerful counter-narrative.
And this whole experience seems to feed directly back into Asif's book, right? The source suggests he was trying to grapple with the questions raised by that historian in Uch.
It does. The book is framed as an attempt to take away the supremacy that the question of conquest held. Supremacy not just for the author personally, but for the whole field of South Asian history, and crucially for those politically charged origin stories we see today.
So by rereading the Chachnama, he's fundamentally challenging the idea that the story of Islam's arrival has to be primarily about violence and foreign imposition.
That seems to be the core move.
And the hope, as the source puts it, is that this kind of approach can spark a shift, a paradigm shift, in how we think about Muslim pasts in India.
Moving away from those sealed-off histories.
And towards narratives where political ideas, culture, social life were actually forged across different traditions within a landscape that was genuinely shared and intertwined.
It's really a call, the source implies, to open up how we look at the past, to maybe revisit archives we thought we knew, or look at connections we missed, and just ask different kinds of questions.
Because, and the source really underscores this, the stories we tell about our history, especially those origin stories, they matter deeply for how we live now, how we understand our present reality and politics.
Absolutely. They have real weight.
So circling back to where we started this deep dive, rethinking that story of Islam's arrival. Instead of this seemingly inevitable path of invasion leading to animosity, Asif's work, just by looking closely at one text, encourages us to see something much more complex much earlier on.
Yeah, a reality where maybe integration, finding ways to accommodate each other, sharing political ideas, these weren't just impossible dreams. They were actively being discussed and theorized, even within a text later used to argue the exact opposite.
The main takeaway from this source really seems to be the narratives we inherit about the past, especially those defining how major communities first met, aren't just historical facts. They actively shape our present.
They really do. They build the lens through which we often see things today.
So this exploration of a book of conquest leaves you with a pretty powerful thought to consider, doesn't it? If re-examining just one text, the Chachnama, can so fundamentally shift our view of a key historical moment, turning it from simple conquest to complex integration and shared thought, well, what other basic origins narratives do we take for granted?
Good question.
What other historical moments that seem clear-cut now might actually hold a much more intricate, maybe more hopeful, intertwined reality, hidden in sources we haven't looked at closely enough or interpreted differently?
It makes you wonder how challenging the conquest narrative in this one instance might change our perspective on similar stories elsewhere in history, too.
Definitely something to think about.